Good afternoon. My name's Ron Binsley. I am the current executive director of the Isthmus Society, and I'd like to welcome all of you here to this Isthmus Society lecture. Today, Denis Alexander will be speaking on genes, determinism, and God. Before turning things over to the Isthmus Society's chair, I'd just like to take a moment to say a few words about the Society itself. The Isthmus Society is an organization comprised of UW-Madison faculty and students, local religious leaders, as well as interested community members. The Society is committed to building up a constructive and open dialogue between religion and science. And it does so by promoting public lectures such as this one, public symposia, and other special events. Past events of the Society have featured such topics as the religious reception of the theory of evolution, the ethics of human embryonic stem cell research, as well as the neuroscientific basis of human spirituality. The financial support for the Isthmus Society comes primarily from the John Templeton Foundation, as well as the Lubar Institute for the Study of the Abrahamic Religions. If you think you'd be interested in following the Society's events, we have at least one more event this year in the spring, and we'll be hosting a class this spring also on religion and science. Please do add your name to the list we have. There's a book in the back. You can give me your email, and I will make sure you get announcements about future events. Otherwise, you can go to our website, which is www.isthmussociety.org, and there you can also sign up to be part of our list. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Society's chair, Jeff Harden. He's the chair of the UW-Madison Zoology Department, and he is also the current head of the Isthmus Society. Jeff Harden.
Thanks, Ron. Well, first, on behalf of the Isthmus Society, let me thank all of you for coming. It's really exciting to see all of you here. Also want to thank Ron Binsley for doing much of the legwork that makes these events possible. He's an outstanding organizer, and the Isthmus Society would be absolutely hopeless without him. So, Ron, thank you very much. The other thing is there are a couple people standing at the back. If you want to be really brave, there are some seats on the edges or in the middle, and we encourage you to have a seat. And I see some people being very kind and scrunching into the center. We really appreciate that, too. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Denis Alexander. Denis, I've known Denis for quite a while now, and we've been trying to get him here for a formal event for some time, and it's really a delight that he was willing to piggyback off of some meetings that both he and I were attending in Philadelphia to come be with us here in Madison today. Denis read biochemistry at Oxford before obtaining a PhD in neurochemistry at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And then he went on to pursue work at the Imperial Cancer Research Laboratories in London for a number of years, during which he also spent substantial time developing university departments and laboratories overseas, predominantly in the Middle East. In particular, as an associate professor of biochemistry of the medical faculty at the American University of Beirut, where he helped to establish a national unit of human genetics. Following his time in London, Denis moved to Cambridge, where he became chairman of the molecular immunology program and head of the Laboratory of Lymphocyte Signaling and Development at the Babraham Institute, where he continued his research on molecular immunology. Now, I know there are a number of scientists here, and for you scientists in the audience, Denis has an impressive publication record, including in recent years papers in Cancer Cell, Nature Cell Biology, and the New England Journal of Medicine. In 2006, though, Denis embarked on really a second career as the founding director of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion in St. Edmund's College at Cambridge University. The Faraday Institute is an interdisciplinary organization dedicated to fostering dialogue between religion and science. And in addition to its academic research programs, the Institute fosters public understanding of these issues through courses, conferences, lectures, seminars, and public media. This year, Denis became Director Emeritus of the Institute, where he remains a fellow. And I must say, based on his travel schedule, I think his professional activities have not slowed in the least. He writes, lectures, broadcasts widely in the field of science and religion. His work spans the gamut from newspaper op-ed pieces to popular books to scholarly edited volumes and journal articles. Since 1992, he's been the editor of the journal Science and Christian Belief, and currently serves on the National Committee of the British organization Christians in Science. He's also a member of the International Society for Science and Religion. And in addition to the myriad other things that Denis is doing, he's currently a trustee of the John Templeton Foundation, whose generous support has partially funded today's event. Now, Denis has written a number of books. Let me just mention a couple of them. First, I think really one of my personal favorites from 2001 is a book called Rebuilding the Matrix, Science and Faith in the 21st Century. He wrote a 2008 book, Creation or Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? And he's recently co-edited a volume with our own Ron Numbers from the University of Chicago Press in 2010 called Biology and Ideology, From Descartes to Dawkins. Denis's stature in the science and religion dialogue worldwide has recently been further validated by a selection as this year's Gifford Lecturer. Quite an honor. I'm very pleased that Denis has received this well-deserved recognition. In fact, I believe some of what we're going to hear today is a sort of a test drive of some of the material he's going to be presenting in a more expanded version in his Gifford lectures. It's really a treat to have Denis. And today, as Ron has already said, Denis is going to speak to us on the topic of genes, determinism, and God. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Denis Alexander.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jeff, for that very generous welcome and introduction. And it's great to be here back in Madison again. It's not my first visit here. I'm only sorry to miss Ron Numbers on this trip. It turns out, actually, that Ron Numbers is speaking this evening in Philadelphia in a conference where I've just come from. So we almost crossed in the air, I think, today, ironically. So there we go. I want to not only thank the organizers for this kind welcome, but also I want to just acknowledge the help of Nell Whiteway, who's a research assistant in the Faraday Institute over there in Cambridge, for her help in quite a bit of the work you'll be hearing about, particularly in doing literature surveys and doing a number of research projects which are associated with this particular rather vast topic, actually. I always worry when I give titles like this, but I know this is a sort of generalist kind of audience, and so we'll see how we get on. I guess one of the striking features of cultural life over the past decade has been this permeation of our language, political, cultural, historical, and other ways, with the language of genetics and DNA. The final draft, of course, of the human genome was completed already back in 2004, revealing these 3.2 billion, it's an English billion, I think it's the same here, isn't it, nucleotide bases or genetic letters that comprise the human genome. Just a few weeks ago, those biologists here will be well aware of this wonderful outpouring of 30 papers all at once on the so-called ENCODE project. The ENCODE stands for the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements. It aims to map out all the functional elements of the human genome, a vast project. The main paper in this series, there on the screen, I hope you can see the screen okay. It starts by emphasizing that the human genome encodes the blueprint of life. Note the language. The genome is often referred to as an instruction manual, giving the impression that the human body is somehow assembled from a kit, rather like a piece of furniture. Do it yourself. You get the kit and you go back and you put it together with this instruction manual. The phrase, it's in his or her DNA, or in the organization's DNA, has come into our daily language as a sort of characteristic of of all kinds of writings that come out in all kinds of contexts. Brad Pitt, whilst discussing US gun control, suggests that it's in Americans' DNA to own a gun. Think about that one. The cloud computing service provider Oxygen assures us that our security is in their DNA. American Express is integrating social media into its marketing DNA. London has apparently had 2,000 years of urban DNA. Whatever that means, I haven't a clue. But there you go. It's in our daily language. I don't think the situation is helped by the insistence of the media to keep reporting the discovery of a gene for this, that, or the other. There are mean genes and gluttony genes and gangster genes, liberal genes, conservative genes. There's even the whimsical suggestion which came out in the London-based, or the Manchester-based Guardian newspaper a couple of years ago, that there's a geneticism gene that predisposes some people to think that behavior is caused by genes, and so on. So, whereas, of course, as we all know, I think, whether we're biologists or not, a gene is just a stretch of DNA that encodes a protein or possibly an RNA molecule that communicates messages to the cell and so forth. I mean, that's it. There is no single gene that encodes any kind of behavior in any living organism. You just don't get any single gene that will behave in that kind of a way. Now, I think scientists, for the most part, are quite careful in their language on this point, not entirely, but I think on the whole, they want to avoid some of the exaggerated language that spills out into the media. But often, and here's an example, you can get a sober, serious paper like this one that came out in PNAS recently, which is all about this monoamine oxidase gene, a variation of the gene, and the title is Predicts Behavioral Aggression Following Provocation. Comes out of a research group collaborated from a collaborative group, but it's led out of Brown University. So the authors report this correlation between this particular variant gene and levels of aggression in human subjects who've been provoked. And maybe unwisely, I think, the authors refer in the abstract to the nickname for this particular gene, which is the warrior gene. But on the whole, the paper is, I think, as I say, quite sober in its reporting. Now let's look at the press release that came out of Brown University for this, referring to this particular piece of work. And what does it say? Warrior gene predicts aggressive behavior after provocation. Subjects penalized opponents by administering varying amounts of hot sauce. Okay, they did actually. That's what the whole experiment involved. Now remember, that story is coming out of from a press officer in a sober institution. So by the time you get there, now the jump, of course, into the media, we're not surprised, are we, that language is taken up and exaggerated under various headlines. 1 in 3 men have violence gene. That's the headline on the ABC News website. Scientists say it's the warrior gene. So the story is actually pitched in a way that highlights free will as well. But I think the pressure on today's news-hungry world is incredibly high to package stories in a way that's going to over-dramatize the findings, and often in the process, I think, communicates genetics and the latest discoveries in a way that's not always very helpful, and actually can be quickly wrapped up in an ideological package, again, which conveys a certain message to the readership, which maybe they want to hear, but which is not an accurate representation of the science. Now, of course, these days, everybody knows that genes and environment interact to generate living organisms such as us. There are no serious genetic determinists around, I don't think, as far as I know. No one seriously believes that our complex behaviors or our life decisions are determined by our genes, despite this rather famous quote from Jim Watson. We used to think that our fate was in our stars, now we know in large part that our fate is in our genes. Neither really are there any strict environmental determinists. I don't think so. I mean, there used to be, but I just, as a sort of academic stream, I think that's a fading part of the academic community. I mean, everybody knows that we are the products of complex gene-environment interactions. And I think therein, actually, lies the problem. I want to suggest today it's precisely in this kind of dichotomous language that we find a rather fragmented image of human personhood, in which these sort of reified forces of genes, our environment, are pictured as some sort of tug of war. They are pulling in different directions in order to try and explain the complex entity we call human personality, as if it's some sort of battleground of competing influences. The dichotomous language, of course, is inherited from John Galton, Darwin's first cousin, who first... sorry, I said John, it's Francis Galton, Darwin's first cousin, who first introduced this contrasting language of nature and nurture in his book of Men and Science, Their Nature and Nurture, 1874. As Galton himself pointed out, the phrase nature and nurture is a convenient jingle of words, useful because, and I quote from Galton, it separates under two distinct heads the innumerable elements of which personality is composed. But Galton adds that no carefulness of nurture can overcome the evil tendencies of an intrinsically bad physique, weak brain, or brutal disposition. Okay, he's a late Victorian, you have to take that into consideration. But in his book on twins, Galton concluded that nature is far stronger than nurture within the limited range that I have been careful to assign the latter. And it was really Galton who set the parameters for the discussion right up to the present day, and it's incredibly powerful image, this jingly image of nature and nurture. You know, if you go and browse Amazon or browse the shelves of any academic sort of bookshop, they're loaded 140 years after Galton with these books that you see before you, with titles such as Nature or Nurture, Nature and Nurture, The Nurture of Nature, Nurture by Nature, Nurture through Nature, The Nature-Nurture Debate, Bridging the Gap, Nature or Nurture, The Great Brain Debate, and then there's even the rather worrying title, Nature versus Nature, Why We Kill. I'm sure that sold more than the other ones, but I actually feel rather sorry for all these authors and publishers desperately trying to find some new combination of the words nature and nurture, to try and come up with a new title. Now, I don't want to be dismissive. I mean, many of these books are excellent. I mean, there's some very good material in these books. I'm not being dismissive of them by any means. But I simply want to point out, I'm certainly not the first to do this, that the time maybe has come, to move on and to move the goalposts so that we can leave behind, I think, a rather unhelpful dichotomous sort of picture of nature and nurture, as if that's what the discussion is really about. I think part of the problem is our minds and our cultures are so imbued with dichotomous language, hot and cold, light and darkness, extrovert, introvert, Republican, Democrat, nature, nurture, genes, environment. We tend to think in these rather sort of opposing forces, as it were, and I think that's partly, that's the ideological package, if you like, where we find ourselves most comfortable in helping, trying to think about different topics. So, as I say, the purpose of this lecture is to seek to move the goalposts. I want to forsake dichotomous language. I want to reframe the discussion within a different kind of a matrix altogether, a matrix that I think does more justice to contemporary biology and to the rich biological complexity of what it means to be a human person. And I think in the process we'll see also how important that rebuilding of that matrix is to theological questions as well. And so I'm not going to, I realize this is a series on science religion, and so we are going to be thinking about religion a little bit later on, but I'm going to focus on the science at the beginning. Now, in place of the dichotomous nature-nurture framework, as I say, which I'm suggesting is no longer fit for purpose, I want us to go for a framework which I would like to suggest is more faithful to the science, and I want to introduce it under a different acronym, a new acronym actually, which is definitely not as jingly as nature and nurture. And I'm going to shorten it to DICE. Possibly that's an unfortunate shortening for an acronym. We'll see. Developmental, integrated, complementary interactionism. I said it wasn't as jingly as nature and nurture. But I want to work through some of those words and some of those concepts. And I apologize now to the biologists who are here for what's going to come next, because I realize this is a multidisciplinary series, and I know not everyone here is a biologist, so I'm going to run through some fairly straightforward biology, but biology which I think is important as we think about this particular topic. And this is to really illustrate what we're talking about when we talk about Denis. So let's start then with a newly fertilized human egg, a zygote. And of course, what's inherited from the parents is not naked DNA, which by itself can do nothing, but a complex system of DNA and RNA and proteins and nutrients that together are then going to operate cell division and further cell development. And in fact, the human egg, just prior to fertilization, it now turns out, contains at least 3,000 different proteins. It contains around 7,500 different messenger RNA molecules, and it contains many thousands of small regulatory non-coding RNA molecules. So it's a very complex system. By itself, DNA would be as useless as having a CD with some sort of computer program on without any computer to run it on. And right from the beginning, from the word go, there are two types of environment. There's the immediate, let's call it the microenvironment of that complex system that we know as the cell, and then there's the macroenvironment of that very, very early embryo, which now starts moving down the fallopian tube, and then, of course, becomes very quickly exposed to the mother's environment and the mother's own broader environment. Now, the point here, of course, is that DNA and these two types of environment, they're completely integrated from the very moment of fertilization. The key part of a gene is other genes. Its own special environment is the rest of the genome. It operates as an integrated system. One of the key findings of the ENCODE project, published, as I said, just a few weeks ago now, is that at least 20% of the genome, perhaps more, it's discussable exactly how much, involving around 500,000 distinct DNA sequences, is involved in regulating how genes are expressed. As we know, there are only around 21,000 protein encoding genes. There are around 16,000 RNA genes. But these, in turn, are regulated by hundreds of transcription factors, proteins which switch genes on and off, this vast, complex network of interactions. And so genes, like people, function according to the company that they keep, known technically in the biological world as epistasis. And in the early zygote, it's not the DNA which causes development to begin, but it's rather the protein transcription factors which are inherited from the mother, from the egg. Those are the ones that then switch the various genes on and off in those very early hours, early days of that zygote to then induce the first wave of replication. So if you like, proteins are the players in that DNA orchestra that cause the genes to play an integrated symphony of life. And you've got causal networks which are operating here in all directions. Following implantation, of course, the fetus is now exposed to this whole new array of environments coming through the placenta, from the macro environment represented by the mother's blood circulation. We've got oxygen, we've got hormones, we've got glucose and proteins and lipids and alcohol maybe. We've got drugs or non-drugs and so on. The fetal size even is controlled by the uterus of the surrogate mother in the case of an IVF surrogate motherhood. And so big surrogate mothers will tend to have, they'll tend to give birth to bigger babies, irrespective of the size of the biological parents of that baby. And of course, during pregnancy, the mother's changing physiologically and mentally, and she in turn chooses to change her daily environment. Later in pregnancy, the fetus can taste and smell and hear certain stimuli inside the womb in ways that affects the child's behavior following birth. And that explains why a newborn will choose its mother's voice and face over other females, but as it turns out, not so much if its mother was depressed during pregnancy. And so it's increasingly recognized that what we used to call innate behaviors are actually behaviors established during this process of fetal development as part of that very complex gene microenvironment, macroenvironment interaction and integration. And then, of course, the next huge step in human development occurs at birth. The newborn's then bombarded with all those great array of sights and sounds and smells and touch and language and people and dogs and cats and all the other fascinating experiences that then begin to impinge upon that early development of the immediate postnatal brain. And the development of the brain is critically dependent upon that exposure. I think sometimes we think of the newborn's brain as some sort of miniature version of the adult brain. It's not really. It's a completely different kind of an entity. It's a self-organizing system that only self-assembles correctly if the right inputs are available at the right time. Our brains contain around 10 to the 11 neurons, something like that, but in total around twice that number of fetal immature neurons develop during fetal life, 9 months, and half of these are then pruned away during development. At the peak growth time in utero, around 250,000 new fetal brain cells are being produced every minute. An extraordinary burst of development there. But those fetal brain cells are actually neuroblasts. They're undifferentiated cells. They've yet to develop into neurons. And so in the newborn, the synaptic connections are sparse, the axons are not even myelinated, and it's then the experience of that early growing infant that helps shape the structure and synaptic architecture of its brain. Just look at the synaptic density of the newborn's brain from birth up to 24 months, and you see this incredible arborization, the synaptic density, going up in leaps and bounds during that period. The average weight of the human brain triples during the first year of life, from 300 grams to 900 grams, due mainly to the growth in the number of synaptic connections, but also the size of the dendrites, the axon bundles, myelination, and so on. So it's not growth in numbers of neurons so much as the growth in the actual organization of that developing brain. And of course, there's a huge literature about the plasticity of the brain during that period. There are clearly critical periods at which sensory input is vital for the development of specific brain areas. If a baby at birth has cataracts in both eyes, is actually blind from birth, then the visual cortex doesn't develop normally, and permanent visual impairment can result if that problem is not dealt with very soon. Children born with cataracts in both eyes, untreated, have large permanent deficits in motion processing as well. That's quite a recent finding, whereas children who develop cataracts after about 6 to 12 months have no such deficit. And so you've got this brain displaying considerable plasticity, and it's the wider environment that interacts with the growing child to help construct that functioning brain. Again, a complete integration between genomics and the environments. If we now continue along our developmental trajectory into adulthood, that integrated interactionism, if you like, becomes even more striking between those various levels of the environment. Here we have the growing individual beginning to make lifestyle choices about their diet, about their exercise, about the levels of stress, about their alcohol intake, about their smoking, about what environment they choose, their drug taking or not, their choice of friends, whether they're lonely people or they're communal, sociable kind of people, and so forth. And all of those factors are feeding back into the genome through epigenetic modifications of the individual's DNA that actually regulates the expression of their genes. Of course, epigenetics, the big growth area in genetics these days, it refers to those heritable chemical modifications which regulate how genes are switched on or off. And if you like, if the genetics, the actual DNA, provides the hardware of inheritance, then epigenetics provides the software, if you like, those regulatory levels which control how the genome is expressed in a given individual. Or if the DNA sequence is the musical score on the page, then epigenetics is all those Italian words like fortissimo that tell you how to play the music of life to the genome. So epigenetic regulation then also provides that key communication pathway whereby the environments, plural again, are feeding back to impinge upon that genome and every cell of the body in the way that it's expressed. So that's a sort of picture I want to paint through DICE, developmental integrated complementary interactionism. And that's a process, that developmental process is, of course, going on right from the moment of fertilization all the way to death. It never stops. That development in this biological view doesn't end until death, actually. So all the components, all the time of that process are tightly integrated. There's continual interaction going on between all the components of the system, and many complementary processes are happening in parallel. So you have there a kind of subversion of that linear causal relationship type interaction that might be suggested by the nature-nurture language. So I'm hoping that this sort of begins in our minds to move the goalposts. As I say, I'm certainly not the first to suggest this kind of trajectory by any means, but clearly there is work to do in this area. And so the insight of Dicey, the developmental approach, is that 100% of the phenotype of any complex organism involves genetics, 100% involves the environment. Now, if you're a non-biologist, and indeed if you are, I think thinking about this sort of integration in complex systems is difficult. So I hope you'll forgive me if I, for a moment, look at something a little bit easier, possibly, and that's a Black Forest cake. Now, think about the cake. Most of the cake, and I'm thinking about the recipe here, most of the recipe is flour, more than 50% actually. I looked this up. These are real ingredients, okay? So, no flour, no cake. Less than 1% is baking powder. No baking powder, no cake. Around 8% is chocolate powder. No powder, no chocolate cake. No correct oven heat, no cake. And so the cake then is the product, the fruit of a complex developmental process in which the proper proportions of the recipe are indeed critical to the eventual outcome, but it would be odd and indeed impossible to try and assign proportionality to the original components in the finished product. By that time, of course, there is no baking powder. It's disappeared, and all those other ingredients have chemically been transformed. And so the cake as a whole actually has emergent properties which are non-reducible to its initial components, just as the wetness of water cannot be reduced simply by a study of the gases, hydrogen and oxygen. There are emergent properties in developmental pathways which are important to recognize. That also brings us then to this important C word in Dicey, complementarity. There are dozens of different complementary interactionist narratives going on during this process of development. Proteins and genes, proteins and cells, cells and organs, cells and hormones, sensory inputs and neuronal development, synapses and memory, choices and epigenetics, all kinds of narratives that you can tell, which are all complementary narratives. They're all really important ones. Different scientists will focus on different aspects of those narratives, and they, I believe, are absolutely essential to look at them all. But they're all part of those complementary narratives that kind of weave a narrative that eventually makes up the complexity of human personhood. I think it's also good to remember that the notion of causality becomes quite problematic when we're considering such complex systems. Now, philosophers have a field day on causality, and I don't want to get into all of the complexities of what we judge to be causal relationships. But I think in this context, anyway, strict causality only really makes sense when it refers to relationships between components at the same narrative level. And so it's individual genes plus the molecular machinery of the cell that causes proteins to have the amino acid sequence that they do. But I don't think genes are really causal agents in anything else. I mean, they, by themselves, strictly speaking, they don't cause human development. They don't actually cause human disease, strictly speaking, and they certainly do not cause human personality or human behaviors. Now, by saying that, I'm not, of course, saying that genes aren't important in all of those things. Genes are involved, totally involved in all those things that we just mentioned. But I think it's the operation of the system as a whole which, for example, causes development or disease. Human life starts with the inheritance of a complex system, and it's with the dynamic characteristics of that ongoing complex system that human identity is to be found. Now, given, I think, the power of developmental biology to paint a picture of human identity for us that renders, I'm suggesting, that language of nature and nurture outdated, I think we might well want to ask, why is it, and others have asked this, many others have asked this, why is it that this dichotomous language of nature and nurture is so difficult to shift? It's so resistant to change. And I was just interviewed on Wisconsin Public Radio just a couple of hours ago, and again, that conversation reflected that particular point. I think, as I was saying earlier, I think one of the reasons is undoubtedly just this proliferation of books coming out all the time, or the blogosphere is full of the similar language and articles and so on, reflecting upon the latest discoveries in genetics, but using this language of nature and nurture to, as it were, tell the story. And I think that's one of the reasons. A powerful contributor, though, also, I think, to the maintenance of dichotomous thinking comes in the world of behavioral genetics and its very distinctive definition of the word heritability. Now, each human individual picked randomly from anywhere in the world varies between each other in around 0.5 to 1% of their genome. That number is changing all the time, actually, now that we're sequencing tens of thousands of human genomes. But the variation is much more, in fact, than we used to think, even 5 or 6 years ago, actually. And so new mutations are constantly being contributed to the human gene pool. It's recently been estimated, based on whole genome sequencing, that a newborn contains, on average, around 60 new mutations not found in the parents. That's a new discovery. That was only published a few weeks ago. Much of that genetic variation clearly makes no difference at all. It's in non-coding regions, or as far as we know, in regions that are not involved in gene regulation. But, of course, a lot of it is likely possible to make a difference. It's been worked out that on average each person carries around between 250 to 300 variant genes that are expected to make a difference to gene function. That is, variant in comparison with a standard reference genome sequence. So the challenge of behavioral genetics, then, is to try and find out whether genetic variation between human individuals has anything to do with differential behaviors. And this can only be attempted by studying populations, using twin studies, adoption studies, and all that kind of thing. Now, I'm only going to mention this quite controversial field of inquiry very briefly, and I'm not going to do it justice, I'm afraid, because of lack of time. But I think it's important at least to realize the way in which this particular research field is keeping alive the dichotomous language we've just been thinking about. And it's very important, I think, to understand the way in which this field uses the word heritability in a particular technical sense, which is actually quite different from the way that we use the word heritability, I think, in daily speech. So just a brief summary of that. Again, I apologize to biologists here for whom this will be very well known. But the heritability H in behavioral genetics is an estimate of how much of the variation of a trait, a particular trait, or more precisely, the inter-individual differences in phenotype in a given population is due to genetic variation. So you have a population, they vary in height. How much of that variation in height of that particular trait can we ascribe to genetic variation in that particular population? So heritability is actually a dimensionless value. It refers to a ratio of variances, that is, the proportion of the phenotypic variance that can be attributed to the variance of genotypic values. And so we're going to have one basic equation. I promise you this is the only equation in this talk. The basic equation is h squared plus c squared plus e squared equals 1. And these are all in reference to variant proportions. So H then represents the heritability. C represents the shared environmental influence on the trait, and E represents the non-shared environmental influence, and they're all squared for statistical reasons. And so these three correlations represent proportions that, taken together, are assumed to explain the trait, and so they have to add up to 1. So the genetic influence plus the shared environmental influence plus the non-shared environmental influence is said to equal the total influence on the trait. And so in the classic approach, the variation of a given trait in a population of monozygotic, that is identical twins, or dizygotic, that is fraternal twins, raised in the same family, you measure that. The investigator looks at how closely the scores between the twin pairs correlate with each other. Correlation measures how similar the deviations in one variable are to deviations in another variable. We do the math and we find, for example, that if the correlation regarding IQ measurements, for example, in identical twins is 0.75, for the non-identical twins is 0.5, then the heritability is twice the difference, or 0.5. So in that case, we say that the heritability of IQ is 50%. Now, in practice for twin studies today, biometrical modeling techniques are used that take into account some of the assumptions, some of the complications involved, such as the genotype-environment correlations, when there are possible effects of an individual's genetics on the environment, genotype times environmental interactions, which refer to the differential sensitivities of genotypes to environments, and so forth. So that's the very basic equation, and actual studies, as I say, the statistical methods used are a good bit more sophisticated than that might indicate. Now, the field of quantitative behavioral genetics has a very long history of controversy. It continues to the present day. Each year, a whole cluster of books are published, which are either strongly defensive of the assumptions of the field or strongly critical of the field. I think it's fair to say that even the practitioners in this field don't always agree on some of even quite basic premises, actually. And so it continues to be a field full of active discussion. And it's complicated by all kinds of things. We don't have time to go into all the complications now, but for example, we know that identical twins are not always actually identical at the DNA level due to mutational changes that occur after embryo splitting. There are now more than 400 papers actually in the literature on twin pairs that are identical twin pairs that are discordant for various physiological or medical pathologies and so on. And even at birth, twins, as I mentioned earlier, certainly vary at the epigenetic level. In fact, the epigenetic differences at birth appear to be greater in the identical rather than in the non-identical twins, which is sort of a little bit counterintuitive. Now, time doesn't allow to go into all those. There's a huge discussion going there. There's a huge discussion. We don't really have time to get into all the finer points. What I want to do is just make two general points, because I think if you've never sort of dipped into this field, it's important to remember just two things, okay, two general points. The first, as I say, is that the word heritability has changed its meaning during the latter half of the 20th century to some degree to refer to what we just talked about in the technical sense of heritability. That is to say, the proportion of variation of a trait in a population that can be attributed to genetic variation. So that is not inheritance. That's not what inheritance is about. And the unfortunate thing is that the meaning of the word often elides from one meaning to another. Even, I'm afraid, that some of the writers on twin studies who write popular books are not careful enough in their use of language. Use of language is so important, isn't it, in science? And they're not always careful enough to show us in their writings where they're eliding between one meaning or another. Sometimes the impression is given that a particular trait in a particular individual is actually caused 50% by their genes and 50% by their environment. That's not what inheritability is about at all. Okay, that's not what it's about. So the language game here can be a little bit confusing. Let me illustrate this point by a simple illustration. Again, it's one used by Patrick Bateson in Cambridge. First, we notice that nearly all people have two legs. And when they only have one leg, it's nearly always due to an accident. In other words, it's due to the environment. So the variation in legginess in the population is 100% environmental and 0% heritable. Now, that sounds a bit odd because everyone knows that you need genes in order to have legs. And for leg building, generally speaking, you definitely need a genetic program for that. Of course, the point here is it's just that the genetic program that you have in the growing, developing embryo always encounters, fortunately, the same type of environment, and so legs develop, and the system invariably builds two legs. Likewise, the heritability of having a brain is zero. There's no variation in the population with respect to the trait of having a brain and so forth. So this simply makes the point that heritability doesn't tell us anything really about the complex interplay of components that we were thinking about in the context of the Dicey model, that as a matter of fact lead to the development of traits in individuals. Now, of course, people in the behavioral genetics field know that very well, but often that doesn't filter out. That's not always well recognized or well understood in the more general kind of reading public. The second point to note about heritability is, I think, that its very method of calculation tends to perpetuate this dichotomous linguistic distinction between genes and environment, nature and nurture, which we've been suggesting is no longer really fit for purpose. At least it's no help. I don't think it's any help at all if we wish to understand the biology of the development of traits in human individuals. The only approach that will help us address the question as to how far the genetic variation that exists between individuals has any bearing at all upon their different behaviors. And of course, once you assign mathematical values to three different proportions of variation that taken together are said to add up to 1, then I think it's inevitable that those proportions will come to be seen as reified entities that in some sense interact or compete in generating something. Now, in reality, correlations between variants in a population just can't play that kind of a role. They're not things in that sense, they're correlations. But I think the perception generated in the reports of heritability values is often along such lines, and that's where things get complicated. So, how then are we going to address the question of genetic determinism? I haven't even defined yet in this talk what I'm referring to in using this word determinism. Determinism refers to individuals, it refers to their choices, it doesn't really refer to variation in a population. So we can define determinism in its hard form, if you like, as the thesis that given our particular genomes, our lives are not really up to us and are constrained to follow one particular future. That's the definition that I'm going to use. And then there's a softer form of genetic determinism, which states that given our particular genomes, our lives are more likely to follow one particular future, which is clearly very different from the other definition. And some people, I think some philosophers would say that's not really determinism at all. But I'm going to keep those, the sort of hard form and the soft form, for the purposes of discussion within this lecture. Now, do we find hard genetic determinism in the human population? I would say definitely we do. We discover it particularly in medical genetics, where a particular pathology does indeed often entail constraint, very sadly, to a particular future. I'm going to put that on one side. That's, of course, a vast topic in itself. But let's think a bit more about soft genetic determinism. And I think it's the burgeoning field of behavioral molecular genetics which is the most relevant here, either through genome-wide association studies or through prior knowledge of a particular molecular pathway that's the subject of investigation by particular neuroscientists perhaps. Variant genes are identified that correlate with particular human traits. Let's look at a particular example to see what sort of information that tells us. And I think sometimes the best way is to look at an example to do that kind of job. Here's a paper that came out in 2010 in Nature. It describes a Finnish population in which a particular gene variant was found to correlate at greater than chance in a population of prisoners characterized by severely increased impulsivity. And even the generally rather restrained journal Nature gave the news item reporting these results the headline, "A Gene for Impulsivity," a phrase I have to say carefully avoided by the authors of this particular study, and indeed in the news report itself. It goes without saying there is no gene for impulsivity, as we were thinking earlier. Now, the problem is that once these inaccurate phrases are used in the scientific literature, one cannot really blame the media and the blogosphere for their own headlines on such reports. And here's the reports coming out of that Nature paper, which include the violent gene, genetic mutation found only in Finnish men that makes them fight. Another one, impulsive. It may be a genetic mutation. I like this one. Scientists discovered a gene that triggers violent rage. Drunken rage could be in your genes, and so on. Anyway, so we note the deterministic language that immediately comes to the fore in reporting these kinds of papers. So here we have a single mutant gene as a powerful causative agent triggering violent behavior in men over which apparently they have no control. And also, for most people, it's a faraway country, which I think has a certain ideological spin to it, if I might say so. Actually, the reality is much more mundane than that. So let's just think a little bit about what they actually described in this paper. They discovered a novel mutation called Q20 style. Let's just call it Q20 for the sake of this discussion. A mutation is introduced, in fact, into the stop codon of the gene encoding one of the 15 serotonin receptors which are found in the human brain. The mutation results in a very low level of this receptor protein, and they discovered this novel mutation in 17 out of 228 cognitively normal, albeit violent individuals displaying high impulsivity compared to its presence in 7 out of 295 normal controls. In other words, you have here 3 times, roughly threefold higher tendency for this mutant Q20 to be found in those scoring high on impulsivity than in those who were average with regard to this trait. That's the basic finding of this paper. Okay. So, what are we to make of this correlation between a mutated gene and a violent subpopulation of offenders? Well, we note, first of all, that there are 5.3 million people in Finland. In this paper, they estimated that about 106,000 individuals are carriers of the Q20 mutation, just 2% of the population. In actual fact, the number of Finns in prison at any given time is around 3,500. They have a very low prison population. Well, let's not do comparisons. Okay. So, but clearly the vast majority of people wandering around in Finland bearing this Q20 mutation are not violent offenders. And secondly, it should be noted that each individual worldwide varies in around 1 in 1,000 of their DNA nucleotide bases or genetic letters, making a total of around 3 million so-called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs as they're known in the trade. And so it's quite possible that the 17 violent offenders in this study also share hundreds of other SNPs or variants in common besides the Q20 mutation, which might also identify them as a particular cohort. But it's quite likely that none of these SNPs, not even Q20 possibly, have anything to do at all with impulsivity. And so, of course, we're back to the old slogan, which we all know, that correlation does not necessarily entail causation. So, the conclusion of this study is, I think, it is of interest that the Q20 mutation in the serotonin receptor gene correlates with a small subpopulation displaying high impulsivity associated with criminality, but also the vast majority of the carriers of this mutation are non-violent, law-abiding citizens. And so the study per se, despite the media hype, actually provides no justification for a belief in genetic determinism, I think not even in the soft genetic determinism that suggests that given our particular genomes, our lives are influenced to follow one particular future. Nevertheless, let's face it also, I would want to say it's entirely plausible that there are cohorts of gene variants, dozens, perhaps hundreds, which perhaps do correlate with individuals with a tendency to be impulsive, and which therefore contribute to the rich diversity of the human population. This particular finding doesn't exclude that possibility at all. Now, what would happen if there was a gene that correlated with nearly all the criminality in the world? Could we then talk about causation? That would be a very interesting finding. Well, as it happens, there is. So if you take 131 countries worldwide and you look at their population, 96% on average of their population is male, and I think we know the gene that identifies the male population is found on the Y chromosome. It's known as the SRY gene. And so universal is the correlation between the SRY gene, without which we males would not be male, and criminality, I think we can safely say that no other genetic correlation will ever be found between a particular genetic variation and criminality that surpasses this one. And yet, we still, I think, hold nearly all males responsible for their criminal actions. We put them in jail as soon as they're convicted. And furthermore, I'm happy to say that we note that most possessors of the SRI gene in the world are not criminals. That's the good news. So the SRI gene does not cause criminality. Although clearly we can't go to the opposite extreme and say it has nothing to do with human behavior at all. But it gets more complicated. So taking the field of behavioral molecular genetics overall, a picture is emerging of hundreds, probably thousands of variant genes, which taken together contribute to the rich diversity of the human population. The data are entirely consistent with the process of developmental, integrated, complementary interactionism. Variant genomes, unique to every person on Earth who has ever lived or will ever live, are surely intimately involved in the development of those broad swathes of our different personalities, providing the overall contours that guarantee the unique identity of each human individual. So how do we bring this biologically conceptualized notion of human personhood into conversation with religion? I would like to suggest that a useful bridge is provided by the theological idea of humankind made in the image of God. There has, of course, been a vast amount of academic reflection on this much discussed notion, perhaps unsurprisingly when you consider that it's contributed historically to the shaping of Western values, legal systems, political systems, medical care, education, and the justification of human rights. As Karl Barth noted in his Church Dogmatics, in reviewing the long history of its interpretation, every age has tended to press the phrase image of God into its own contemporary philosophical and religious thought. And so in an attempt to avoid that tendency, I'd like to start by thinking how the original readers of the Genesis text might have understood this phrase, and then the relevance of the idea to the developmental view of human identity that Dicey paints for us. So, here is the first mention of the phrase in that wonderful theological essay, Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make Adam, humankind, in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And so God created Adam in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Close quote. Now, the question then is, how would the first readers of this text have understood the idea of humankind being made in God's image? An important clue comes from the many contemporary texts that talk about the king as being made in the divine image of one of the panoply of polytheistic gods that were revered by the surrounding nations. Here, for example, is a 7th century Assyrian king, Esarhaddon, being addressed by one of his correspondents, the astrologer and court official Adad-shum-usur, as the image of the god Bel. And I quote, "A free man is as the shadow of God, the slave is as the shadow of a free man, but the king, he is like unto the very image of God." Close quote. Now, there are many similar comments to be found particularly in the Egyptian literature of the time, but also in a more limited way in the Assyrian literature. And so most likely the early readers of Genesis would have first thought of kingship as they encountered this idea of humankind being made in the image of God. Humankind created with dignity and worth, clearly short of divinization, but nevertheless called to play a delegated kingly role, male and female alike, in caring for the created order. As the readers of Genesis read about the image of God, they might also have thought about the statues set up by the Assyrian kings in the lands that they had conquered. So in 1979, a statue of a king dating from the 9th century BC was dug up in northeastern Syria, inscribed with his achievements, referring to the statue in both Assyrian and Aramaic equivalents as the image and likeness of the king, exactly the same phrase we find in Genesis 1. And so the statue represented the delegated divine authority of the king. And so humankind was delegated by God, as we read on in Genesis 2, to care for the earth, to name the animals, to enter into relationship, God's, if you like, ambassador on earth. Now, there are four particular strands in this idea of humankind made in the image of God I'd like to now just briefly bring into conversation with genetics. First is the value and status of each human individual, irrespective of their genetic status. I think there was a time when the idea of the image of God was perceived much more as a kind of list of characteristics, such as rationality, creativity, and so forth, that supposedly distinguishes humankind from the rest of the animal kingdom. I don't think that really gets us to the heart of the idea as we see it in the Genesis text. Instead, we see more this idea, as I say, of a delegated value and status bestowed by God that exists irrespective of the frailty and transience of human life. And so the value and status of humankind is established not by a set of intrinsic capabilities, but by divine decree. Whereas in the Babylonian creation myths, humans are created in order to be slaves of the gods, here it is God who cares for humankind and cares and provides for them. And so those whose genetic endowment entails that they suffer some handicap in life, be it physical or mental or both, are as much sharers of the image of God as anyone else. The fact of humankind being made in God's image subverts any move to make distinctions between individuals based on their genetic endowment. By the same token, that fact also provides a powerful motivation to engage in the healing of those with genetic disease. And for Christians, it is, of course, Christ who perfectly practices what being made in the image of God entails, and clearly healing was central to his ministry. A second relevant point, I think, is the sheer physicality, if I can call it that, of the Genesis teaching about the image of God, picked up and expanded through the rest of the Old Testament scriptures. Humankind are not spirits nor angels, they're made from dust. And in Genesis 2:7, of course, we have this wonderful phrase, the Lord God formed humankind, formed Adam from the Adama, from the dust of the ground, the Hebrew play on words there, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and Adam became a nephesh, a living being. So the Adam became an animated, enervated body. As the theologian Gerhard von Rad once commented, one does well to separate as little as possible the bodily and spiritual. The whole man is created in the imago of God. And as we work through the Old Testament, we find a unitary idea of personhood, albeit displaying different aspects, where the words soul, spirit are often used interchangeably, highlighting this unity and diversity of the human personality. I think that's very consistent, myself, with Denis, where the various components of biological development are completely integrated in an ongoing process of development. We are our genomes just as much as we are our epigenetics, we are our brains, we are our physical bodies. So far from being a fragmented tripartite being, in Hebrew thought, there is this reveling in the sheer wonder of the physical integration of personhood. The third resonance that we note between the idea of the image of God and our genetic identity is its insistence that it involves diversity. Male and female, he created them. What the theologian Karl Barth referred to as the definitive explanation given by the text itself of the image of God. God's image in man is the reciprocal relationship of human being with human being. The image in Barth's thought describes the I-thou relationship between person and between the person and God. Now, I think Barth may have somewhat overstated the case, but I think there's a really important truth here. The image is not a sort of static status quo, a kind of list of fixed human characteristics, but it's this dynamic, ongoing developmental process carried out in relationship with very strong eschatological overtones, if I can call it that. We fast forward to the New Testament and we find the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Corinth, and I quote, that just as we are born the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of the man of heaven. It's a very physical sort of tenor to it in a way. So again, this idea of God's image in a developmental relational diversity coheres well with a more biological story that Denis provides, a story that focuses on the development of diversity that guarantees the uniqueness of every human being who has ever lived, or who ever will live on this planet. There's enough diversity there in the genome and the environment and the system to guarantee uniqueness. I think it's an amazing thought. The fourth point we notice is the idea of the image of God, the relationship of the image of God between the Dicey concept. Is this entailment of moral responsibilities and duties placed upon humankind, implying clearly genuine choice? The command is given in Genesis 2 not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The command is disobeyed. Human autonomy seems much more alluring. There are terrible consequences: separation from the tree of life. The assumption of genuine human responsibility is inescapable in this text. And as we've seen, there's nothing in contemporary genetics, barring some rare but tragic cases of medical genetic pathologies, that in any way, in my view, subverts moral responsibilities. Genes do not influence us. They certainly do not control us, as if our genomes were somehow operating in a separate space, isolated from the rest of personhood. There are no genes for gluttony, nor for impetuosity, nor for crime, nor for religiosity, nor for voting Republican or Democrat. However, there are people who choose to do or be all of these things, hopefully not at the same time. And with that thought, I will close. So thank you for your attention. Thank you. I think we've got some time for discussion, and we'll go straight into that. I hope you'll feel free to make points. And here's just a shameless plug for a few books, some of which were mentioned earlier on. One book that wasn't mentioned, by the way, is this book, The Language of Genetics. If you're interested in the field of genetics and you don't have a background in it or would like to learn more, this is a book I published last year. It's The Language of Genetics and Introduction. So it's a sort of global kind of overview of the field for those who perhaps would like to dig a little deeper. Right, over to you, please, for questions and discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. No, I wouldn't say Dicey is a view of God. I wouldn't go that far. I think, to my mind, Dicey is simply an acronym that pulls out certain words. It's a sort of pegs to hang ideas on, really, that are useful in discussing the biology of human development. So it would only play that rather limited role. But I think when I'm talking about a bridge, I think it's a healthy sort of picture for having a conversation with theology in the way I was trying to outline at the end. So I don't want to endow it with any divine or godlike properties, but in the sense of, but maybe that's not what was in your question. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah. Yes, thank you for that clarification. Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I mean, okay, so my theology of creation is very much influenced by the idea of God as immanent in the created order. That is, a God who is absolutely sustaining, upholding, immanent, I don't know what other words to use, the created order at every moment. And therefore, indeed, that's what makes science possible. That's what renders the universe intelligible and why it's possible to do science. So, I mean, that would be my framework within which I operate. Yes, so I can certainly see it within the intentions and purposes of God in bringing about biological life on this planet and no doubt on other planets as well, to have these kinds of properties. You know, properties which are complex and integrated and where every individual is really genuinely unique. Thank you. Please, yes.
Is there any role for the supernatural in your concept of personhood and the interaction between environment and genetics?
Yes, well, I think, once you've got through the dicey bit and you have a human person with big frontal lobes and these wonderful social mental capacities, then you have someone who can pray. And so when that person prays, they are engaging in talking, in my Christian framework, to a God who is there, who listens, a God who's interested in persons praying and who can talk to them. So, yes, I believe that interaction between God and humankind is there, but in a rather different kind of way, that once you have free choice and once you have the capability to have religion and religious beliefs and moral beliefs and so on, then it opens up a whole dimension, which of course we haven't talked about at all in this lecture, which is the relationship with God and worship and so on. So I would see deity, if you like, is necessary but not sufficient for the idea of the image of God. And the idea of the image of God very much includes the idea of relationship with God. Now it's interesting actually, there's quite a move in some theological circles to restrict the theological notion of the image of God to a completely naturalistic explanation or description, let's say just deity, and deity is where it stops. Okay, that is the image of God. So then the image of God becomes those evolutionarily evolved individuals who have these particular types of properties, period. Okay, I would go, I don't personally go in that direction. I would want to say that deity is necessary but not sufficient for what the image of God is about. Deity is the biology, but there's a theological story which gives it a wider context. So deity is not in contradiction to that wider theological story, but to my mind, the theological story places the deity within a coherent context, if I can call it that. And the genetics, I mean, I mention this because in the radio program just I did earlier on this afternoon, so this came up in the conversation. Could it have been otherwise? In other words, might it have been the genetics would have turned out in a way that would have been rather hostile to the notion of humankind made in the image of God? And I think the answer is yes, it could have done. In other words, we could, 50 years ago, we could have imagined a genetics, human genomes, where actually the programming was very tight, where we have hundreds of thousands of genes that encode proteins, and hundreds of thousands that encode RNA molecules, sufficient to encode actual behavioral, programs, if you like. And of course, 50 years ago, many people thought that's the way it was going to turn out. And had that been the case, so that we would have been, as it were, programs, rather as simple organisms, are programmed pretty much, with a few variations, but much more programmed than we are, to have a behavior in a certain direction, in certain environments, it could have turned out that way. And that would have been, not a refutation, but it would have been a severe embarrassment, I think, to those of the monotheistic faiths who do hold to this sort of understanding of humankind made in the image of God. That would have been difficult to reconcile. So are the data that, if not refute, then at least count against theological ideas? I think, yes, there are, actually. And it so happens that genomics hasn't worked out the way. Okay, but it could have done. Could have done. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Just use this word a couple of times. You didn't make any connections, but could you possibly make a connection based on what you said, linguistic, biological, and theological, between the words gene and genus?
Between genes and genome.
Genus.
Oh, genus. Sorry. Oh, okay. Yes. Well, people have played a lot with that in artistic, more kind of the humanities context. In terms of Genesis, genes, Genesis, absolutely, and in terms of book titles as well, and so on. There's a great scope to do that sort of work, I think. Yeah, it's not my field, so I won't comment on it more because I might not do it very well, I'm afraid. But thank you for that. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Jeff. Yes.
So
yeah.
I sort of have a guess as to what you might say given your analysis of Finnish prisoners, but there's been a lot of discussion about the so-called God gene, a gene that would somehow predispose a human organism towards the impulse of religiosity. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so one of the surprising things to the behavioral geneticists in this field was, I'm not quite sure who brought up the first paper. I mean, it's maybe about 15, 20 years ago through twin studies and so on, the sort of standard kind of format that I was mentioning earlier on, did do a study of religiosity. One of the problems about measuring religiosity is no one can quite agree what you're going to measure, okay? But, the whole slew of papers came out from the behavioral genetics field about the heritability of religiosity. And what they discovered was that in adults, certainly the adult population, there is a heritability. It comes out, depending on your study, 30%, 40%, and so on. Okay, this is all based on adoption studies, twin studies, identical twins, fraternal twins raised in the same home. So everyone kind of scratched their heads and said, well, what does that mean? Okay, heritability of religiosity. I mean, they're not suggesting your actual religious belief as the genes has anything to do with that, but the suggestion then started coming out that, there is a certain tendency in certain people to be religious and so forth and so on. Okay, then it got more complicated. And the complicated bit, of course, is what hasn't made it into the press so much. The complicated bit was they started looking at early adolescents and populations of teenagers and found the heritability was either for religiosity, and so found that the heritability is either zero or it's so small that it's statistically pretty dodgy, actually. And I would take it as zero, actually. And so they said, oh, okay, so that means that if you're brought up in a religious home, then the dominance of, that influence is likely to be, overwhelming any kind of genetic influence. That was the way that those data were interpreted. Okay, but that sounds a little bit odd, but, I mean, you can understand, if people are told to go to church, when they're teenagers, and that's often one of the little things tick box on the list of religiosity, church going, for example. Then they leave home, they decide they're not going to church anymore, their parents aren't around to tell them to go to church, and so on. So you can see there could be a diversification. Now what actually makes the story quite difficult to interpret then is when you come back and think about the adults, if you look at what happens to identical twins and non-identical twins, and there are hard data on this, people have looked at these studies, the amount of contact between identical twins, significant social contact, is far greater in adulthood than amongst the fraternal twins. Monozygotic twins, on average, just feel closer. They often go and live in the same house together. Some of those twins... some twins go the other way, and sort of rebel against that sense of, very close identity, but many don't, and many just keep in contact much more during the rest of their life than the non-identical twins. So, what does that mean then in terms of political beliefs and religious beliefs and so on? It means actually there's much more likely to be environmental convergence between identical twins, I would want to suggest, in terms of religious beliefs and also political beliefs, and the same sort of studies are relevant to political beliefs as well, voting patterns, things like that. So once you've got monozygotic twins who are converging or maintaining the similar kinds of religiosity or voting conservative or whatever it is, and you've got dizygotic twins going off and becoming more different, diverging, then you're going to have heritability. That's what heritability is about. It's about the differences in variation between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. So I actually have a feeling in this particular case, there's a very simple explanation for the data, and that is simply contact time between identical twins when they're adults and, where it's different when they're in teenage years. That would be the way I would probably interpret that, actually. So just to follow that up, I mean, there is clearly no God gene or God spot in the brain. People are doing scanning. I think it's fairly clear, that people who pray and cogitate about religious things use the similar parts of the brain that they do when they're talking about persons, actually, talking about other persons a lot of the time, that sort of thing. So the whole sort of wave of God spot, God gene type of publicity that swept over the world, I don't know when it was, 5 or 10 years ago, I think is sort of been pretty well debunked, actually. Would be my view on that. Yes. Please, yes.
With everything that you said in the first part of your lecture, would you be saying that if there were a bunch of guys and they didn't look at all like us, or if there were no God?
Wait a minute, if there were a bunch of guys who didn't look like us... A bunch of guys? Oh, gods. Oh, I'm sorry. It's this transatlantic... Yeah, I mean, sorry, yeah. A bunch of gods who did what? Sorry, then I was...
They didn't look like us.
Right.
Or there was no God.
Right.
It confused me with the image of God.
Right. Okay, I got you. So, well, if there's no God, there's clearly no image of God, and so you don't need to do that theological work, do you? I mean, I'm doing the theological work because I think it's important for those who are in the Abrahamic faith, let's say. I mean, those of any faith, but the image of God idea is much more common within Judaism and Christian faith, and so. I'm trying to do that theological work to see what conversation there can be between the science and the theology. If you don't believe there is a God, then you clearly won't believe in a concept such as the image of God. That wouldn't make any sense at all. If God doesn't exist, there cannot be an image of something that doesn't exist. That's a whole other discussion. Clearly, yeah, but a point well made. I mean, yes. Please, yeah.
There's a comment, philosophical bend in Eastern religion more than Western, for karmic influence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a potential effect on humans in their present-day life. Do you believe in a karmic influence? And if you do, is it compatible or injectable into your dicey scheme in terms of creating a human identity? It would be another influence, I think.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, point one, I'm definitely not an expert on Hindu reincarnation type religious systems. I myself don't believe in a karmic influence. I believe that every individual is unique. They haven't happened before. And so they have in their physical embodiment, they have their period of life on this earth, and that's their existence. That's their physical existence. So I personally don't believe in karmic influence in quite that religious framework. I could easily see that people who do believe there is a karmic influence could well be influenced by that belief. I'm going to deconstruct it a little bit, but that belief can be very powerful. I've been to India enough, and we've had Farad Institute courses several times in India in the past few years. So we've had Hindu speakers and Christian speakers and so on, and so we've had a number of conversations. But it seems to me that the belief that you have a previous life that in some way is influencing you in this life is going to influence you, whether that's there or not. I'm sorry, it sounds a bit of a psychological put down, but I think it will be influential. So in that sense, if your parents believe it and your environment believes it, and also they believe if you're a Dalit and they believe you're in that caste, and that's where you belong, that's going to be very powerful as well, isn't it, in the dicey environmental thing. Your view of yourself, your view of your role in society is going to be hugely influenced by that. But you see, I would see those influences as more social, political, this worldly, if you like. I'm rather a materialist, actually. Sorry about that. Yes, please.
You talked about it a little bit, but I'm interested in your views as to how the plasticity of the brain that's emerging can influence, whether it tips in the direction of nurture versus nature.
Mm-hmm.
Plasticity.
Yeah, yes.
To environmental
Yes.
influences.
It's a very, very difficult question. I mean, of course, some of the answers we've got about plasticity come, as so often happens, in the biological field, from tragic situations. We have a baby with cataracts, and the sight doesn't develop, and then we realize, oh, okay, you need to see things in order for the occipital cortex to develop properly. And so much of our data comes from that sort of thing. Now, but clearly, the developmental system that ends up with us being here has got to be pretty constrained, hasn't it, in order for to have a human species, to have a Homo sapiens species, And so there are clearly heavy constraints, but those constraints are channeled because the environments are very, very similar. And so, for example, we have, generally we get food, when we're babies. Generally we have oxygen to breathe. Generally we have all the sort of biological environments that will enable us to develop along certain trajectories. The very tragic ones, of course, are the very few cases of feral children, that sad case in California of the child that was kept, away from language, until they were past the age at which they could learn the language anymore. So clearly there's a developmental system whereby you need to hear language at a certain point, a certain period of life. and that's rather discussed, how early, how late, but it's certainly a critical period for linguistic absorption and learning that has to happen. And if you go past that without hearing a language, you will be suffer from linguistic deficits the rest of your life. I mean, that's the limited data that's there so far. So clearly, we know those really early childhood experiences are critical, for certain developmental things. But these are very much the broad paintbrush, aren't they? They're not on the detail. And I think that's where it's really, very hard to know, actually, very hard to know, as to how much epigenetic modification is there from early environmental experiences which actually do influence, and become part of future personhood and decisions. That's a very early stage. I think those data are coming more, and maybe somebody here is working on that and they can tell us more about that. But I think please, are you working on epigenetics? No, okay. I was hoping somebody here was working in that area and they could tell us the answer. Sorry, please, go on.
Given what you just said, how do you explain, well, we just talked about religiosity, but it seems to be a fairly abstract concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so how is it that, I've heard that most people around the world have some concept of a belief in God, not necessarily religious practices, but a belief in whatever you might call God. How is it that something so abstract can happen to so many people?
Hmm.
Talking about, there's certain constraints like oxygen, and there is a bottleneck, so we all develop as Homo sapiens, but then as time goes by, we develop in different ways, but this thing seems to be a commonality, but also very abstract, something that develops everywhere, irrespective of their environments.
Well,
Eskimo and sub-Saharan, everything.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? It does seem to be one of the distinguishing characteristics of humankind that people are religious, and it doesn't matter where you go. But I'm not quite sure about the word abstract. I mean, nobody knows what. I mean, the origin of religion is obviously hugely discussed, heavily underdetermined by the data. I mean, the different ideas are out there, can be quite plausible. Nobody really knows, let's be honest, exactly, where does religion start? How early in human evolution? All those kinds of questions are rather unknown. But clearly it's a common characteristic of all peoples everywhere in the world today, as far as we know. But I'm not sure about the word abstract. I mean, most of the theories are rather not non-abstract in some ways, in the sense that it's to do with human structures, social structures, to do with motherhood and fatherhood and caring and families, and how those social human structures are put together, and so on. So that surely has lots to do with religion as we go around the world. It affects human structures and so on. So I'm not sure, it's not just abstract. I mean, that's my point. It's not that it doesn't have an abstract element to it, but obviously it's very physical. It's very social in many, many ways. So I think one has to look at that if one's going to talk about the origins of religion. The other aspect of it is coming out, of course, out of cognitive psychology. I think have you had Justin Barrett to speak here or not? No? Okay, so Justin Barrett, who was in Oxford, who's now over in Fuller, has done a lot of work on this, on the way in which children are natural theists, the easy way in which very young children would ascribe supernatural agency to certain events that happen and so on. And so there's a whole evolutionary sort of psychology story there, which the data look pretty impressive, I have to say. He's just trying to repeat those data, which are mostly based on data in the States and places like Mexico and so on, but trying to repeat those data in China in a very different, cultural Confucian Taoist sort of families, which will be fascinating to see what comes out of that. So it does seem to be the case that very young children naturally believe in God. Okay, so that's what they do. That's what they find a natural thing to do. And so that seems to be interesting, that our brains seem to be constructed in such a way that they find a god, a supernatural agent of some kind, quite a normal, natural thing to do. Now, of course, you'll get people who will then go on to say, if you're Richard Dawkins, you say, well, that's a childhood belief, and you have to lose that as you grow up, and then you say to Richard Dawkins, what about maths? young babies are quite good at maths as well. They know a lot of maths. They know quite a bit of physics, sort of childhood physics. Even young babies have a fairly sort of critical realist view of the world when it comes to maths and physics. But that also applies to religion in a way. And so we don't lose maths when we grow up. In other words, the fact of something being a natural belief doesn't tell you whether it's a correct belief, of course, or not. You still have to justify it as you grow up, or not, in various ways. But I think it's an interesting phenomenon that very, very young babies, very young children, will easily ascribe supernatural agency to things and believe in God quite easily. Yeah.
So I think a few moments ago you suggested that this dicey scheme was necessary but not sufficient for this idea of imago Dei.
Yes.
And that if something like a strong genetic determinism had seemed correct, that would make this Christian belief difficult. But so my question is, there are broad streams of Christian theology that are highly deterministic, and wouldn't, even if if strong genetic determinism that seems plausible, or if the pendulum were to swing back that way, wouldn't that be compatible with a more deterministic Christian theology?
Well, now we're going to get into Calvinism, can't we? So okay. Well, I mean, I think looking at the idea of the image of God in the context of Genesis, it does seem, it assumes responsibility. On the day you will eat of the fruit, you will surely die. So you better obey. And then, so in other words, there seems to be an assumption of responsibility. And as you go through Hebrew thought and the Hebrew scriptures, wow, if that's not an assumption of moral responsibility, I don't know what is. What are the Ten Commandments about? So in other words, you get a very strong emphasis on choice. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Boo, great challenge, you see. So I think whatever Christian theology is done in, then one can go to the New Testament and so on. Now, of course, you can get, an ultra-Calvinistic thought whereby free will is pretty much, downgraded, if you like, and so on. I mean, there clearly are those streams of theological thought. But I would want to say, I think if you look, let's not take denominations, let's just take the Bible text as a whole. It seems to me that whatever you think about the sovereignty of God and God's choice and so on, the assumption of moral responsibility is always there. It always assumes that you can choose, you can disobey God, you can go your own way, you can be autonomous. That's always underlying assumption, I think, right to the Old Testament and the New Testament. So that's the sort of position I think I would want to go in. So, I think what you were suggesting was that if it had come out the other way, that genetically it's very deterministic, we'd all become Calvinists. Is that what sort of what you were going?
That's actually not
Yeah.
from that position at all.
Yeah. Just wondering. Yeah. No, well. Okay.
Maybe that's a great place to stop. Let's thank Denis.
Okay. So, right. Okay. Thank you.